which that distinction that was made in family or couples therapy, where one member could have a particular kind of transference, maybe a particular kind of basic assumption, when others might have, or that it might be individual in a moment and then group in another way. Is that,
well,
I think somebody was trying to talk about that
yes.
before.
Yes, that was a question that I think one of you asked, or you asked earlier, yes.
No. So it made me remember that, and I was trying to relate it to that.
Well, we just have to keep in mind that basic assumptions relate to group dynamics. For as long as you consider the family as a group, which you might, there certainly are basic assumptions. There are basic assumptions in the group per se, right? The way, let's say, the family conforms in a group mentality and has the different basic assumptions. For instance, it's very common, isn't it, that families may get together having a common enemy that they need to fight. The common enemy could be an illness, or could be a neighbor that's making a nuisance, or a political party that they want to fight against, or a fear that they have of some calamity. Poverty could be a common enemy, right? They could become a group of basic assumption of dependence, right? Depending on daddy or on a big brother, if daddy is impaired, for instance, or mommy is impaired. Yes, all of the above. In combination with the therapist, then that leads to another group. Now this is a family group plus a therapist. So the group is now not the family, the group is the group plus therapist, yes. Now, if we think in Oedipal terms, for instance, the Oedipal situation, the Oedipal family is a group, isn't it? In some way, one could say that Oedipus, if you wish, was thought of as the Messiah. And the family group couldn't bear the disruption that this special creature that was told by the Sphinx to, in the future, kill the father would do. So the family, not being able to hold him in the family, decided to kill him. Only that he didn't die, and then he came back, and so on and so forth. Yes. In any case, yeah, I want to go to today's task, because otherwise the 5 minutes are becoming 50 minutes too long. All right, today's work then.
Chapter 14.
So here we have now Bion entering the analytic life, and particularly into the society or the community where things were happening, namely the controversies between Klein and Anna Freud, and the Freudian group gathering more and more influence, and Bion deciding to belong to that group, to the Kleinian group, and get analysis from the leader of the group. And Blandoni well remarks that this was Bion's remarkable experience with a woman, when all the time before, since the unfortunate death of his first wife, he felt that women were too problematic to be around, and he rather would belong to the army, right, where there were all men, then have to deal with women that were so unfortunate, beginning with his mother, who agreed to send him at age 8 alone to London, right?
So that was the culture, wasn't it?
It was, right. But then it was also Bion's experience that he would never forget, a sort of a traumatic event for him, right? And that then reoccurred in Bion's life when his first wife died.
And when he was jilted by his first love.
Right.
Yes, also,
Right.
exactly, right. So there he goes into analysis with Klein, and certainly changes his life in many ways, right? So that is in some way the little background. Let us go into the conceptual work now. Psychotic thinking, right, and psychotic personality. Again, the background was that when Klein postulated the early anxieties of babies as psychotic anxieties, right? Meaning that if they were to reoccur later in life, you would say this is a psychosis, but only that in babies this was part of the development, right? What she said about these early psychotic positions or psychotic functioning encouraged some analysts like Hannah Siegel and Herbert Rosenfeld to experiment with treating psychotic patients with psychoanalysis, barely making any changes to the technique or to the setting. And Bion went there to do that too.
Do you know what those changes were?
Pardon me?
Do you know what those changes were?
The changes?
Yeah.
Well, yes. Most of the schizophrenic patients that they treated were hospitalized, not by the analyst. They were hospitalized and got hospital care and psychiatric care, right? And were brought by an individual nurse to the office of the psychoanalyst. So things were pretty safe and very contained.
Was the office of the psychoanalyst in the hospital?
No.
Oh, so they took the person out of the hospital to the office.
The nurse took a taxi and took the schizophrenic patient by taxi to the office of the analyst and stayed there until the hour was over and took the patient back to hospital. The psychiatric nurse, right? And those were golden times when the National Health Service was rich and could afford that. Nowadays it doesn't happen any longer. Yes, that it was basically that. Other than that, all they would do was interpret the psychotic anxieties as they happened.
But the change then would be in the creation of a splitting of the analytic care away from the setting in which the rest of the care was taking place.
Well, but that's barely a change, isn't it? Because the analytic setting always happens in isolation of everything else. I mean, the patient lives with his family and has a hell of a time, but the analytic setting happens in isolation. It's separate from what happens to the patient in his family or in his job or anywhere else, right?
So the techniques, once the patient walks into the room, the psychotic patient walks into the room, are seen as equivalent.
You know, I have a notion that her mic,
It's better.
her mic gain
Yeah.
was on too high.
Feedback was what I was thinking. Yes.
Oh, okay.
But you just stopped it with that, so that might.
That's good.
Okay.
Let's keep going.
Very good. All right. But in any case, I think what we now I would like us to discuss is Bion's findings, right? Just as he made his experiences in groups and went from there to conceptualize his observations, the same thing he did when he started treating psychotic patients, only that he didn't approach psychotic patients, let's say, in a total virginal state. He was influenced by Melanie Klein's ideas, although Melanie Klein had not treated psychotic patients, but she did treat children with psychotic anxieties. One of which was a little child named Dick, who came to her diagnosed as an infantile schizophrenia, but looked more like what nowadays we would call an autistic child. But in any case, that was his background, and then he just went into the hours observed and came up with a lot of concepts that he discovered and named and worked upon, taking Klein's theories as a starting point, but different from Klein.
It seems to me that the idea that is very, I mean, Blondinot talks about that's his original contribution, but it is that way in which the psychotic attacks his own mental apparatus. And I think this is perhaps where Bion's concept of attacks on linking comes from, right? And that there is a way in which neurotic patients can do that too, you know, sort of attack in a given moment, not perhaps in the same massive way, but in a given moment, attack their own thinking. That the projective identification is not only to the analyst or to the object, but to the mind.
Good. Right.
Self. And I thought that was such an interesting, important concept.
It is in two ways. Well, what you're saying is very rich, no doubt. On the one side, what you are describing is Bion's extension of destructiveness, not only towards objects, but also towards their own thinking apparatus. It can go outwards, but it can also go inwards. And if reality is unbearable for whatever reason, let's say too frustrating, too narcissistically injuring, then there are two ways to react to that. You try to destroy the objects in reality that are offending you, right? Or you destroy the apparatus that allows you the awareness of the objects that are offending you. You blind yourself. Oedipus did that. He ended up blinding himself, right? He didn't want to see the horror of the crime he committed, and how that led then to the catastrophe in Thebe. The other thing that you are reminding us, and this is now beyond, right, in hand of Klein, that is beyond taking up Klein's idea of the duality of instincts, which he took up from Freud, that is that we all have, since birth, if not earlier, life and death instincts, love and hate, creativity and destructiveness, and that they both go together, unavoidably so, that there is a dialectic, an oscillation, or an intermingling of both. The results of that equation may differ, but it's not that you can have one without the other. You can't have love without hate, and you can't have hate without love. You can't be destructive without being creative, and you can't be creative without being destructive. You're both.
But you can be born with more of one or the other.
Exactly.
More destructiveness than love. And that leads to the psychotic state of mind.
Yes.
Or one of the elements of it.
Did you hear that, Judy?
That you can be born with a predominance of a destructive drive?
Yes.
Yeah,
Or
that's Klein too.
Exactly. That is what I'm saying, that Bion picked up from Klein three things, Blondinot reminds us, right? One is the duality of instincts, and giving the death instinct an important place in psychology.